She was being sold because of her facial burns, twisted scars that made grown men look away in disgust, until a blind Comanche warrior touched her face and whispered, "You're perfect." In that moment, everything she believed about her worth, her beauty, and her destiny would change forever. The dust never settled in Fort Worth. It hung in the air like a curse, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that tasted of broken dreams and lost hope. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the ramshackle collection of buildings that made up the town's commercial district, turning the wooden structures into ovens that baked the desperation of their occupants.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The edge of town, where civilization frayed into something uglier and more honest, stood Mackenzie's trading post and auction house. The building squatted like a wounded animal against the endless Texas sky, its paint peeling and its foundation sinking slowly into the unforgiving earth. A hand-painted sign swayed in the hot wind, its letters faded but still legible: human goods and services, fair prices for fair folk. Inside the auction house, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and the particular stench of fear that clung to places where human dignity was bought and sold. Rough-hewn benches faced a makeshift stage where a podium stood like an altar to commerce. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across faces that had seen too much and felt too little, creating a hellish theater where morality came second to profit. This was 1878, 3 years after the end of Reconstruction, and the frontier was still a place where might made right and the weak served the strong. The Indian Wars were winding down, but the scars they left on both red and white communities ran deep as canyon walls. In places like Fort Worth, where cultures collided and survival was the only law that mattered, human beings became commodities as easily traded as cattle or grain. The auction house drew its clientele from the dregs of frontier society, saloon owners looking for girls to serve drinks and provide companionship, ranch foremen seeking cheap labor for dangerous work, merchants needing servants who couldn't run away or complain to authorities. They came with money in their pockets and hunger in their eyes, ready to bid on the broken and desperate souls that circumstances had delivered to their doorstep. On the platform reserved for merchandise, 23-year-old Ayanna sat with the stillness of someone who had learned that movement drew attention, and attention brought pain. Her Kiowa name meant eternal blossom, but the men who would bid on her tonight knew her only as the burned girl or damaged goods, or worse, epithets that reduced her humanity to her most visible trauma. The left side of her face bore the twisted landscape of old burns, pink and white scar tissue that pulled at her eye and mouth, creating an asymmetry that made people flinch and look away. The scarring continued down her neck and disappeared beneath the rough cotton dress that had been provided for the auction, marking her body with the permanent reminder of a night when everything she had ever known had gone up in flames. But what the buyers saw as disfigurement told a story of incredible courage that none of them would ever know or care to learn. 3 years earlier, Ayanna had been living with her grandmother in a small Kiowa settlement near the Red River when a band of whiskey-crazed soldiers had attacked in the night. As the tipas burned around them, she had run back into the flames, again and again, pulling out children, elders, anyone who couldn't save themselves. She had saved 7 lives that night before a burning lodge pole fell across her face and shoulder, pinning her in the inferno. By the time her cousin had dragged her clear, half her face was destroyed, and her left arm hung useless at her side. But 7 people were alive because of her courage. 7 families remained intact because she had chosen their safety over her own. The survivors of the attack had been relocated to a reservation in Oklahoma, but Ayanna's injuries made her a burden on a community already struggling to survive on government rations and broken promises. When white traders came through offering to take surplus population off their hands, her own people had made the heartbreaking decision to let her go. They told themselves it was for her own good, that she might find better care among the whites. But everyone knew the truth. Beauty was currency on the frontier, and Ayana's account had been permanently overdrawn. She had spent 2 years in various forms of bondage since then, passed from owner to owner like a tool that never quite worked properly. She had served as a kitchen servant for a family in Dallas, until their children's nightmares about her appearance convinced them to sell her contract. She had worked in a laundry in Austin until the proprietor decided her face was bad for business. Most recently, she had been the property of a rancher who used her for the hardest, most dangerous work, reasoning that if she was already damaged, it didn't matter if she got hurt worse. Now she sat on the auction block once again, her good hand folded over her burned one, her dark eyes fixed on the rough wooden floor. She had learned not to look at the faces in the crowd, not to meet their gazes or show any sign of spirit that might be interpreted as defiance. Defiance led to punishment, and she had endured enough pain for several lifetimes. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, providing some merciful coverage for the worst of her scars. Someone had attempted to make her more presentable for the auction, forcing her into a clean dress and scrubbing the grime from her skin, but there was no hiding what the fire had done to her. She was damaged goods, and everyone in the room knew it. Augustus Mackenzie climbed onto the platform with the swagger of a man who had made his fortune from other people's misery. At 55, he was a mountain of flesh poured into an expensive suit that couldn't quite contain his bulk. His face was red from whiskey and heat, his small eyes gleaming with the particular malice of someone who enjoyed having power over the powerless. Mackenzie had been running this auction house for 15 years, ever since he discovered that trading in human beings was more profitable than dealing in livestock. He had a talent for finding people at their most desperate moments and turning their desperation into his profit. Indians displaced by war, women fleeing abusive situations, immigrants who didn't understand the language or the law, all became merchandise in his establishment. He prided himself on his salesmanship, his ability to find buyers for even the most difficult cases. A missing limb, a scarred face, a broken spirit, these were just obstacles to overcome with the right presentation and the right price. Tonight, looking at Ayana, he saw a challenge that excited him. "Gentlemen," Mackenzie's voice boomed across the crowded room, silencing the murmur of conversation and the clink of whiskey glasses. "We have come to tonight's most interesting lot. I present to you Ayana, age 23, formerly of the Kiowa Nation." A ripple of interest ran through the crowd. Indian women were often prized for their supposed exotic nature and their reputation for hard work and compliance. But as Mackenzie stepped aside to give the buyers a clear view of his merchandise, that interest quickly turned to disappointment and disgust. "Jesus Christ," muttered a man in the front row, a saloon owner from the looks of his flashy clothes and gold teeth. "What happened to her face?" "Fire, Mr. Brennan," Mackenzie replied smoothly, as if discussing the weather. "But let me assure you gentlemen that this condition in no way affects her ability to work. In fact, you might say it makes her more motivated to please." Crude laughter erupted from several parts of the room. Ayana felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she kept her eyes down, knowing that any reaction would only make things worse. Mackenzie warmed to his task, circling Ayana like a vulture around carrion. "She can cook, clean, tend animals, work in the fields. Strong as an ox despite her appearance. And gentlemen, consider the advantages of her condition. She's not likely to run away, is she? Where would she go looking like that? No man would want her. No respectable family would take her in. She'd be completely dependent on your kindness." More laughter, harder and crueler than before. Ayana closed her eyes and tried to transport herself somewhere else, anywhere else. She thought of her grandmother's voice singing lullabies in the Kiowa language, of the smell of prairie grass after rain, of the feeling of her horse's mane flowing fingers as they rode across the endless plains of her childhood. Now,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
I'll be honest with you, Mackenzie continued, his voice taking on the tone of a conspirator sharing secrets. She's not going to win any beauty contests. But she's healthy, obedient, and desperate to please. Perfect for those jobs where looks don't matter, and you need someone who won't complain about working conditions. He gestured toward her burned arm, which hung slightly crooked at her side. The arm works fine for most tasks, just not as strong as the other one. But hell, you're getting her at a discount price because of it. Where else are you going to find Indian labor this cheap? The crowd leaned forward with renewed interest as Mackenzie's sales pitch continued. These were men who had come looking for bargains, for damaged goods they could exploit without guilt. Ayana's disfigurement didn't repel them, it excited them, because it meant she would be affordable and controllable. In the front row sat Gentleman Jim Brennan, who ran a string of saloons and brothels along the cattle drive routes. He was always looking for girls to work in his establishments, and while Ayana's burns made her unsuitable for his more lucrative ventures, she could still serve drinks, clean rooms, and provide companionship for men too drunk to care about her appearance. Behind him, rancher Cole Hastings studied Ayana with the cold calculation of a man evaluating livestock. His spread was 50 miles south of Fort Worth, isolated enough that he could work his human property as hard as he wanted without interference from authorities. He had a particular reputation for buying Indian women, who he claimed worked harder and complained less than white servants. Near the back, Dr. Edmund Blackwood sat with the patient stillness of a spider waiting for flies. He ran what he called a medical research facility outside town, where he conducted experiments on patients who had nowhere else to go. Ayana's burns would make her perfect for his studies of pain tolerance and healing, and her status as property meant no one would question what happened to her in his laboratory. These men and others like them comprised the regular clientele of Mackenzie's auction house. They were predators who had learned to disguise their cruelty as commerce, who justified their exploitation of the vulnerable as simply taking advantage of market opportunities. "Shall we start the bidding at $20? Mackenzie called out, his gavel raised like a weapon. "Come now, gentlemen, she's worth at least that much for the work you'll get out of her." $20, called out a voice from the middle of the room. It belonged to Sam Morrison, who owned a freight company and was always looking for cheap labor to load and unload his wagons. $25, countered Gentleman Jim, who was calculating how much money he could make from having Ayana serve drinks in his roughest establishment, where the customers were too drunk and desperate to care about her appearance. $30, this from Cole Hastings, who was thinking about the isolated cabin where he housed his Indian workers, far from prying eyes and interference from town authorities. As the bidding continued, Mackenzie encouraged the crowd with a running commentary that stripped away any remaining dignity Ayana might have possessed. "Look at those hands, gentlemen, strong despite the burns. She could work your fields, tend your livestock, scrub your floors until they shine. And that compliant nature, you'll never have to worry about backtalk or rebellion with this one." He grabbed Ayana's chin and forced her to lift her head, displaying her scars to the crowd like a merchant showing off his wares. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong, his fingers digging into her jaw as he turned her face from side to side. "See how the scarring pulls at the eye? Gives her an exotic look, don't you think? Some men find that sort of thing interesting, and with her background, she knows her place. Won't be getting above herself or thinking she's better than she is." The bidding reached $40, then $50. Ayana felt herself becoming dizzy as the voices swirled around her, each increase in price feeling like another weight added to the chains that bound her to this nightmare existence. She thought about her grandmother's stories of the old days, when Kiowa women were valued for their strength and wisdom, when her people rode free across the Great Plains and answered to no one but their own chiefs and the spirits of the land. $60. Called out Dr. Blackwood, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone discussing a laboratory specimen rather than a human being. The bidding war intensified, with each man determined not to let such a bargain slip away. They shouted over each other, their voices growing louder and more aggressive as the price climbed. Ayanna felt like she was drowning in their greed, suffocating under the weight of their casual cruelty, just as Mackenzie raised his gavel for what seemed like the final time, ready to close the bidding at $75 to Cole Hastings. A voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "I will take her." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried such authority that every conversation in the room stopped instantly. Every head turned toward the source of the voice, and what they saw defied their expectations so completely that several men actually gasped in surprise. He stood in the doorway like a figure from another world entirely, tall and lean with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and decorated with eagle feathers that marked him as a warrior of some significance. His clothes were a mixture of traditional Comanche dress and practical frontier wear buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the lamplight like stars, but it was his face that held the crowd transfixed. High cheekbones and strong features marked him as unmistakably Comanche, but his eyes were covered by a strip of dark cloth tied around his head. Scars visible above and below the cloth told the story of some terrible injury that had stolen his sight but left his dignity intact. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world through senses other than sight, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a young Comanche brave who served as his guide. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, too stunned by his unexpected appearance to do anything but stare. "I said I will take her," he repeated, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone speaking English as a second language but with perfect clarity and unmistakable authority. Mackenzie recovered from his shock first, his businessman's instincts overriding his surprise. "Well now," he said, his voice taking on the oily tone he used when he sensed an opportunity, "we have an unexpected bidder. You understand this is an auction, friend. You'll need to match the current bid." The Comanche warrior reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object that glinted in the lamplight. It was a gold nugget, roughly the size of a man's thumb, worth more than most of the men in the room made in a year. "Will this suffice?" he asked, holding the nugget where everyone could see it. The room erupted in whispers and exclamations. Gold was still relatively rare in Texas, and a nugget that size represented wealth beyond the dreams of most frontier settlers. Several men leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on the precious metal with naked greed. Mackenzie's own eyes widened at the sight of the gold. His mind raced as he calculated its value, easily 10 times the current bid. Enough to make this the most profitable sale of his career. But something about the situation felt wrong, dangerous even. Indians weren't supposed to have that kind of wealth, weren't supposed to walk into white establishments and disrupt business as usual. "Where did you get that gold, boy?" called out Cole Hastings, his voice heavy with suspicion and barely concealed. "Racism. You steal it from some prospector?" The Comanche turned his head toward the sound of Hastings' voice, and even though his eyes were hidden, something in his posture made the rancher shift uncomfortably in his seat. "My name is Nahuel," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "I am a medicine man and war chief of the Quahati Comanche. This gold comes from land that my people have owned for generations, land that was ours before your kind. Arrived to steal it." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. These men were accustomed to dealing with broken, defeated Indians who had been stripped of their pride along with their land. Nahuel represented something different, a Comanche who had not been conquered, who still carried himself with the dignity of a free man. Furthermore, Nahul continued, still addressing Hastings but speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear, I am here not as a beggar or a thief, but as a man conducting legitimate business. Unless you question the value of my gold, or my right to spend it as I choose. Mackenzie sensed the growing hostility in the room and moved quickly to defuse the situation. The last thing he needed was a confrontation that might bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. The gold is more than sufficient, he said hastily. The woman is yours. But Nahuel held up his hand, stopping the auctioneer before he could bring down his gavel. I have not yet examined the merchandise, he said. In Comanche tradition, a man does not buy a horse without first touching it, understanding its spirit. The same courtesy should be extended to any living being. The crowd watched in fascination and growing unease as Nahuel made his way to the platform, guided by his young companion. Ayana looked up for the first time since the bidding had begun, her dark eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been hope. Nahuel approached her slowly, respectfully, the way he might approach a wild animal that had been wounded and made fearful by cruel treatment. When he reached the edge of the platform, he spoke to her in the Comanche language, his voice gentle and reassuring. Sister, he said. Though Ayana understood only a few words of Comanche, the tone was unmistakable. I am here to help you. May I touch your face? Ayana stared at him in shock. No one had asked her permission for anything in years. No one had addressed her with respect or kindness since she had been sold away from her people. The simple act of being asked rather than commanded brought tears to her eyes. She nodded slowly, not trusting her voice to work properly. Nahuel stepped up onto the platform and knelt beside her chair, bringing himself down to her level rather than looming over her. His movements were deliberate, respectful, giving her time to object or pull away if she chose. When his hands finally touched her face, the entire room fell silent. His fingers, calloused from years of warfare and survival on the plains, traced the landscape of her scars with infinite gentleness. He mapped the twisted skin, the places where the fire had reshaped her features, the areas where pain had carved itself into her flesh. But there was no revulsion in his touch, no hesitation or disgust. Instead, his fingers moved across her scars, like a priest reading sacred text, finding meaning and beauty in what others saw only as damage. When he reached the worst of the scarring around her left eye, where the skin was puckered and discolored, he paused and spoke words that would echo in Ayana's heart for the rest of her life. You're perfect, he whispered, his voice so quiet that only she could hear it. Every mark on your skin tells a story of courage. Every scar is proof that you survived something that would have destroyed a weaker person. You are not damaged, you are decorated by fire, marked by the spirits as someone special. Tears flowed freely down Ayana's cheeks now, both the scarred side and the unmarked side, as if her body was finally allowing itself to feel something other than pain and shame. For 3 years she had believed that the fire had stolen her humanity along with her beauty. But this stranger, this blind warrior who could not even see her face, had found worth in her that she had forgotten existed. Nahuel stood slowly and turned to face the crowd, his hand resting protectively on Ayana's shoulder. This woman is indeed perfect, he announced, his voice carrying clearly throughout the room. Not despite her scars, but because of them. She bears the marks of someone who has looked into the face of death and chosen to save others instead of herself. In my culture, such marks are signs of honor, not shame. The crowd began to murmur uneasily. This wasn't how these transactions were supposed to go. Merchandise wasn't supposed to be praised or honored. It was supposed to be evaluated and purchased like any other commodity. Mackenzie, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, moved quickly to close the sale. Well then, he said, reaching for the gold nugget, it seems we have a deal. The woman ghosted to no one, Newell interrupted, his voice cutting through Mackenzie's words like an axe through rotten wood. I am not buying her. I am paying her debts and setting her free. The room erupted in chaos. Men jumped to their feet, shouting protests and demands for explanation. This violated every principle of the auction house, every understanding of how these transactions worked. Merchandise was meant to be owned, not liberated. You can't do that. Cole Hastings roared, his face red with anger and frustration. This is a legal auction. You can't just free property. Newell turned toward the sound of Hastings' voice, and though his eyes were hidden, his presence seemed to fill the entire room. I can and I will, he said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Unless you wish to argue the point with me directly. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Every man in the room knew the reputation of Comanche warriors, knew the stories of their skill in combat and their willingness to fight to the death for matters of honor. Newell might be blind, but he was still a war chief, still dangerous in ways that most of these soft townsmen couldn't imagine. Mackenzie tried one last time to salvage the situation. Sir, I appreciate your sentiments, but this is a business establishment. We have contracts, legal obligations. The woman owes substantial debts that must be satisfied. And I am satisfying them, Newell replied, placing the gold nugget on Mackenzie's podium with a sound that rang through the room like a bell. This gold is worth more than enough to pay whatever she owes, with substantial profit for yourself. The only difference is that instead of selling her into bondage, you will be accepting payment for her freedom. He reached into his pouch again and withdrew several silver coins, placing them beside the gold. This additional payment is for her travel expenses and any belongings she may need. She is free to go wherever she chooses, with whomever she chooses, whenever she chooses. Ayanna stared at Newell in amazement, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Freedom was a concept she had almost forgotten, a dream that had seemed impossible after years of bondage and degradation. But this stranger, this Comanche warrior who had appeared like a spirit from her grandmother's stories, was offering her something she had thought was lost forever. And if she chooses to come with me, Newell continued, extending his hand toward Ayanna, she comes as an equal, as a sister, as a human being deserving of respect and dignity. Not as property, not as a servant, but as someone whose courage and spirit have earned my admiration. Ayanna looked at his outstretched hand, then at the faces of the men who had been bidding on her just moments before. She saw their anger, their frustration, their sense of entitlement to her body and her labor. Then she looked back at Newell. This blind warrior who had seen her true worth when sighted men saw only damaged goods. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with gentle strength, and for the first time in 3 years, Ayanna felt truly safe. Then it is decided, Newell said, helping her to her feet. We leave now, before these men decide that their greed is stronger than their common sense. As they walked toward the door, the crowd parted before them, too stunned and intimidated to interfere. But Ayanna could feel their hatred following her, their rage at being cheated of their prize. She knew that this moment of freedom came with a price, that there would be consequences for this disruption of the natural order. The Texas night wrapped around them like a protective blanket as Ayanna and Newell walked away from Mackenzie's auction house, their footsteps echoing against the wooden boardwalks of Fort Worth's main street. Behind them, angry voices spilled from the building like poison from a broken bottle, but ahead lay the vast darkness of the frontier, full of possibilities that Ayanna had forgotten could exist. Newell moved with the confident stride of someone who had navigated countless nights without sight, his hand resting lightly on his young companion's shoulder. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 16, had introduced himself simply as Dakota, a name that meant friend to all in the Dakota language. though he was clearly Comanche by birth. His dark eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, serving as Nawil's vision, while the war chief's other senses provided information that sight alone could never capture. "The horses are 2 streets over," Dakota murmured in the Comanche language, his voice barely audible above the night sounds of the frontier town. 3 men followed us out of the building, but they stopped when they saw our mounts. Ayanna understood enough Comanche to catch the general meaning, a skill learned during her childhood when Kiowa and Comanche bands sometimes camped together during the great buffalo hunts. The knowledge that they were being followed sent ice through her veins. But Nawil seemed unconcerned, almost as if he had expected it. "They will not follow us into the darkness," he said, switching to English for Ayanna's benefit. "White men fear the night. They have forgotten how to listen to what it tells them, how to move with it instead of against it." As they walked, Ayanna found herself stealing glances at this extraordinary man who had changed her life with a single touch. In the dim light of the street lamps, she could see more details of his appearance that had been hidden in the crowded auction house. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent years under the harsh sun of the plains, but there was a serenity in his features that spoke of inner peace despite whatever trauma had stolen his sight. The scars around his eyes were old but still visible beneath the dark cloth that covered them. They spoke of violence, perhaps torture, but also of survival against impossible odds. His hands, she noticed, moved constantly as he walked, not with nervousness, but with the fluid gestures of someone reading the world through touch and sound. He seemed to sense the texture of the air, the way sounds bounced off buildings, the subtle vibrations that traveled through the earth beneath their feet. "Your name," Nawil said suddenly, startling her from her observations. "Ayanna, it is Kiowa." "Yes?" "It means eternal blossom." Ayanna nodded before remembering that he couldn't see the gesture. "Yes," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. She had spoken so rarely in recent years that forming words felt strange, like using muscles that had forgotten their purpose. "A beautiful name," Nawil continued, his voice warm with approval. "Your grandmother chose it? How did you know?" The words came out stronger this time, curiosity overcoming her habitual caution. Nawil smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Among our people, grandmothers are the keepers of names, the ones who see into a child's spirit and choose the words that will define their path. Your name was chosen by someone who saw your true nature, something that blooms eternally, that cannot be destroyed by fire or time or the cruelty of others." They reached the edge of town where 3 horses waited, magnificent animals that spoke of Comanche breeding and care. 2 were war ponies, lean and quick with the intelligent eyes of horses trained for battle. The 3rd was a gentle mare, her coat a soft palomino that gleamed like gold in the moonlight. All 3 were equipped with traditional Comanche gear, hide bridles decorated with beadwork, blankets instead of saddles, and the kind of simple efficiency that allowed for swift, silent travel across the vast plains. "This one is for you," Nawil said, gesturing toward the palomino mare. "Her name is Sitlali. It means star in the old language. She is gentle but brave, patient but swift when speed is needed. Like you, she has known hardship, but has not let it break her spirit." Ayanna approached the mare slowly, extending her good hand for the animal to smell. Sitlali nuzzled her palm with soft lips, and for the first time in years, Ayanna felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She had always loved horses, had learned to ride almost before she could walk, but it had been so long since she had been trusted with such a magnificent animal. "She's beautiful," Ayanna breathed, running her fingers through the mare's silky mane. "But I don't understand. Where are we going? What do you want from me?" Nawil swung himself onto his war pony with the fluid grace of someone who had been born in the saddle. "We go to my people," he said simply. "To a place where scars are seen as marks of honor, where a woman's worth is measured by her courage rather than her appearance. As for what I want from you, nothing that you are not willing to give freely." The cryptic answer both reassured and puzzled her, but Ayanna found herself trusting this strange man who had appeared like a spirit from the old stories. She mounted Citlali with some difficulty, her burned arm protesting the unfamiliar movement, but the mare stood perfectly still, seeming to understand her new rider's limitations. As they rode out of Fort Worth into the endless darkness of the Texas plains, Ayanna felt a sensation she had almost forgotten, the feeling of moving forward instead of simply enduring. For the first time in 3 years, she was traveling towards something instead of being dragged away from everything she had ever known. The night air was cool against her face, carrying the sense of sage and buffalo grass that brought back memories of her childhood. Above them, the stars blazed with the brilliant intensity that only existed far from the lights of civilization. Ayanna found herself remembering her grandmother's stories about the star patterns, the way each constellation told the history of her people and their connection to the vast cosmos. "Tell me about the fire," Nahuel said suddenly, his voice cutting through her reverie. It wasn't a command or even a request. It was an invitation, offered with the gentleness of someone who understood that some stories could only be told when the teller was ready. Ayanna rode in silence for several minutes, feeling the steady rhythm of Citlali's gait beneath her. The question should have brought back the familiar panic, the desperate need to hide from memories too painful to bear. Instead, she found herself wanting to share the truth with this man who had seen beauty in her brokenness. "It was 3 years ago," she began, her voice barely audible above the sound of hoofbeats. "Soldiers came to our camp in the night. They had been drinking, celebrating some victory against another band. They wanted our horses, our women, anything they could take." She paused, gathering the courage to continue. Nahuel didn't push or prompt her. He simply listened with the infinite patience of someone who knew that healing required its own time. "My grandmother was too old to run fast enough. Little Wind was only 7, and her mother had died giving birth to her baby brother. Stormcrow was trying to help his grandfather, who couldn't walk without assistance. There were others, people who needed help, who couldn't save themselves." The words came easier now, as if sharing the burden made it lighter somehow. "The soldiers set fire to our lodges before they left. They laughed as they rode away, calling us vermin and saying they were fumigating our nest. I kept going back into the flames, pulling people out, getting them to safety. I saved 7 people that night. And then," Nahuel's voice was gentle, encouraging, "a burning lodge pole fell on me as I was carrying Little Wind to safety. It pinned me face down in the flames." Ayanna's hand instinctively went to her scarred cheek. "By the time my cousin dragged me out, half my face was gone. The medicine man said it was a miracle I lived, but I knew better. I lived because 7 people needed me to live, because their lives depended on my courage." "And yet you speak as if your scars are a mark of shame," Nahuel observed. "In my culture, a warrior who bears such marks in service to others would be honored above all others. We would sing songs of your bravery around the council fires. Children would be taught your name as an example of what it means to put others before yourself." Ayanna felt tears streaming down her face, not tears of pain this time, but tears of something she couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, or recognition of a truth she had buried beneath years of degradation and abuse. "The white world doesn't see it that way," she said bitterly. "They see only damaged goods, something broken that needs to be hidden away or discarded. I became a burden to my own people because I reminded everyone of what we had lost, what had been taken from us." "The white world sees many things incorrectly," Nahuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "They measure worth by appearance, strength by dominance, value by what can be owned or sold. But there are other ways of seeing, other ways of understanding what makes a person valuable. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses moving at a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting the animals. Lakota ranged ahead and behind them, his young eyes scanning for danger, while Nahuel relied on his other senses to read the night around them. As the hours passed, Ayana began to understand how Nahuel navigated the world without sight. He seemed to hear things that her ears missed, the distant call of a night bird that told him they were near water, the subtle change in the wind that indicated a weather shift, the different sounds their horses' hooves made as the ground changed from hard-packed earth to sandy soil. "How did you lose your sight?" she asked finally, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Nahuel was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same pain she had heard in her own when she told her story. "Bluecoats," he said simply. "Soldiers like the ones who burned your camp. They captured me during a raid 3 years ago, the same raid where my wife and children were killed." Ayana's heart clenched at the stark pain in his voice. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort the way he had comforted her, but she didn't know how. They wanted information about our winter camps, the location of our sacred places, the movements of our war parties. When I refused to tell them what they wanted to know, they decided to make an example of me. His hand moved unconsciously to the scars around his eyes. They used heated iron rods, the kind they used to brand cattle. They said they would make me see the error of my ways, one way or another. When I still refused to betray my people, they took my sight entirely. "But you escaped," Ayana said, as much a statement as a question. "Eventually." A young soldier, barely more than a boy, couldn't stomach what his officers were doing. He loosened my bonds and left a knife where I could find it. I killed 4 men getting out of that camp, including the captain who ordered my torture. The casual way he spoke of taking lives should have frightened her, but instead Ayana felt only a deep sense of justice. These were the same kind of men who had destroyed her own life, who had reduced her to property to be bought and sold. "The spirits guided me to safety," Nahuel continued. "I wandered the desert for days, blind and bleeding, until Lakota's grandfather found me and brought me to his band. The medicine men healed my body, but it was my own spirit that had to learn to see in new ways. And now you help others," Ayana said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Like you helped me tonight." "I help when the spirits guide me to someone in need," Nahuel confirmed. "Tonight they led me to you." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, they crested a low hill and saw their destination spread out below them. It was a hidden valley, protected on 3 sides by steep cliffs, and accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended. At the valley's heart stood a Comanche encampment unlike anything Ayana had ever seen. Instead of the traditional tipa she expected, the camp consisted of permanent structures, adobe buildings that blended traditional Comanche design with practical innovations that spoke of a people adapting to changing times while maintaining their cultural identity. Gardens flourished between the buildings, tended by people who had learned to combine ancient knowledge with new techniques. "This is Refugio de las Almas Perdidas," Nahuel said, using the Spanish name. "The refuge of lost souls. It is where my people gather those who have been broken by the white world and help them remember who they truly are." As they rode down into the valley, people began to emerge from the buildings. Ayana was amazed by the diversity she saw, not just Comanche, but Kiowa, Apache, Cherokee, and even some Mexican and white faces among the crowd. What united them wasn't their race or origin, but something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to be outcasts, to be damaged by a world that valued only certain kinds of strength and beauty. Many bore visible signs of trauma, missing limbs, scars from battles or accidents, faces marked by disease or violence. But there was something different about how these marks were displayed. Instead of hiding their damage, these people wore their scars like badges of honor, proof that they had survived when survival seemed impossible, that an elderly Comanche woman approached them as they dismounted. Her hair was white as snow, braided with silver ornaments, and her face bore the deep lines of someone who had lived through decades of change and struggle. But her eyes were bright with intelligence and compassion, and when she looked at Ayanna, there was no revulsion or pity. In her gaze, only welcome. "Grandmother Winona," Nahol said, bowing respectfully to the old woman, "I have brought someone who needs our healing." Winona studied Ayanna with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "She is beautiful," the old woman said finally, speaking in accented English. "The fire has marked her as one chosen by the spirits for great things." Ayanna felt herself beginning to cry again, overwhelmed by the casual acceptance of people who saw her scars as marks of distinction rather than disfigurement. For 3 years, she had been treated as damaged goods, something to be hidden or discarded. But here, among these lost souls, she felt for the first time that she might truly belong. "Come, child," Winona said, extending a weathered hand. "You are home now. Let us show you what it means to be valued for who you are, rather than what has been done to you." As Ayanna followed the old woman toward the heart of the settlement, she looked back at Nahol. He was standing beside his horse, his face turned toward the rising sun, and for a moment she could swear she saw him smile with deep satisfaction, as if he had completed some important task assigned to him by forces beyond human understanding. The adobe dwelling that Grandmother Winona led Ayanna to was unlike anything she had expected. Built into the natural curve of the valley wall, it seemed to grow from the earth itself, its walls painted in warm earth tones that caught the morning light like honey. Intricate murals covered the exterior, symbols from a dozen different tribes woven together in patterns that told stories of survival, renewal, and hope. Inside, the single large room was divided into different areas by hanging tapestries and carefully placed furniture. Shelves lined the walls, filled with clay pots containing herbs, roots, and other medicines that filled the air with a complex fragrance of healing. Bundles of sage, sweetgrass, and cedar hung from the wooden beams. Overhead, their smoke creating a peaceful haze that seemed to cleanse not just the air, but the spirit itself. "Sit," Winona commanded gently, gesturing toward a low chair carved from dark wood and cushioned with soft furs. "You have been carrying pain for too long. It is time to set it down." Ayanna lowered herself into the chair, feeling her burned muscles protest the movement. She had grown so accustomed to sleeping on hard surfaces and sitting on rough benches that the simple comfort of the cushioned seat brought tears to her eyes. When had she last experienced such basic kindness? Winona moved around the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been healing others for decades. She selected various containers from the shelves, mixing powders and liquids in a wooden bowl while humming a soft tune that seemed to resonate in Ayanna's bones. The old woman's hands never hesitated. She knew exactly what combination of medicines would help this particular patient. "Tell me about the pain," Winona said as she worked. "Not the story of how you got your scars. Nahol has already shared that with me. Tell me about the pain that lives inside the scars, the hurt that has nothing to do with burned skin." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, struggling to find words for feelings she had kept buried for so long. "I don't know how to be a person anymore," she finally whispered. "For 3 years, I've been property, merchandise, something to be used and discarded. I've forgotten what it feels like to make choices, to have preferences, to want things for myself." Winona nodded knowingly as she stirred her mixture. The deepest scars are not always the ones we can see. When people treat you as less than human, for long enough, part of you begins to believe them. But that belief is a lie, child. It is poison that must be drawn out before true healing can begin. She approached Ayanna with the bowl, its contents now a paste the color of red clay mixed with gold. "This will help with the physical pain in your arm and face," she explained. But the real medicine is learning to see yourself as the spirits see you, not as damaged goods, but as a warrior who has survived battles that would have destroyed weaker souls. As Winona began to apply the healing paste to Ayana's scars, her touch was so gentle that it seemed to carry healing energy beyond the herbs themselves. The warmth spread through the damaged tissue, not just soothing the chronic ache that had been Ayana's constant companion, but somehow reaching deeper, into places where pain had become identity. In my people's tradition, Winona said as she worked, scars are seen as sacred texts written by the Great Spirit on our bodies. Each mark tells a story of a moment when you chose courage over safety, when you put others before yourself, when you proved that your spirit is stronger than your flesh. She traced the edge of Ayana's facial burns with infinite care. These marks show that you ran toward danger to save children. They prove that you value life more than your own comfort. In the old days, warriors would paint such marks on their faces to honor deeds like yours. You were born already wearing the marks of a hero. Ayana felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a knot that had been tied too tightly finally beginning to loosen. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember not just the pain of that night, but the satisfaction she had felt each time she emerged from the flames with another life saved. 7 people were alive because of her choices. 7 families remained whole because she had been willing to sacrifice her appearance for their survival. But how do I live with being different? Ayana asked. How do I face a world that sees me as monstrous? Winona smiled, her weathered face creasing into patterns that spoke of decades of wisdom earned through experience. Child, look around this valley. Do you see monsters here? For the first time since arriving, Ayana really looked at the people moving about their daily business outside the dwelling's windows. She saw a man with one arm teaching a group of children how to weave baskets, his missing limb no impediment to his skill or authority. A woman whose face bore burn scars, even more extensive than Ayana's own, was tending a garden, her movements graceful and confident as she coaxed life from the earth. Near the central fire pit, an elderly Apache man who walked with the aid of carved wooden legs was telling stories to a rapt audience of young people, his animated gestures making his tale come alive despite his physical limitations. Children ran between the adults, some bearing their own marks of trauma, but all laughing with the pure joy that only comes from feeling completely safe and accepted. These are not monsters, Winona continued. These are people who have learned that true beauty comes from the spirit, not the flesh. They have discovered that difference is not defect but distinction. Here, your scars do not make you less than others. They make you part of a community that understands the price of courage. As the day progressed, Ayana found herself slowly integrated into the life of the settlement. Winona introduced her to others who shared similar experiences, people who had been discarded by a world that valued only certain kinds of perfection. Each person she met had their own story of survival, their own journey from brokenness to wholeness. Maria Delgado had been a beautiful cantina singer in San Antonio, until smallpox left her face permanently marked. Rather than hiding in shame, she had become the settlement's music teacher, helping others find their voices when the world had tried to silence them. Her scars pulled at her mouth when she smiled, but her eyes sparkled with genuine happiness as she sang lullabies to the youngest children. Joseph, Crow Feather, had lost both legs below the knee in a cavalry charge during the Indian Wars, but had learned to carve prosthetics that were works of art as well as functional tools. He taught woodworking to anyone interested, showing them how to create beauty from raw materials, just as he had learned to create mobility from carved wood and leather. Most remarkable was a young white woman named Sarah, who had been born with a twisted spine that left her severely hunched. Rejected by her own family and sold into servitude, she had found her way to the valley where her quick mind and gentle nature made her the settlement's teacher. Children, who had been called stupid, or worthless by the outside world blossomed under her patient instruction. You see, Winona explained as they watched Sarah leading a reading lesson, here we measure worth differently. Sarah's body may be bent, but her mind is brilliant and her heart is pure gold. Maria's face may be marked, but her voice can heal broken spirits. Joseph's legs were taken by violence, but his hands create beauty that will outlast us all. That evening, as the settlement gathered around the central fire for their communal meal, Ayanna experienced something she had forgotten was possible, the feeling of belonging. No one stared at her scars or whispered behind their hands about her appearance. Children approached her with the fearless curiosity of the young, asking direct questions about her burns that adults would never dare voice. Did it hurt when the fire touched you? Asked a little girl named Rosa, her own arms bearing the marks of some childhood accident. Yes, Ayanna answered honestly. It hurt very much. But you know what hurt more? Thinking that the burns made me ugly and worthless. But you're not ugly, Rosa said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. You're different, and different is interesting. Ugly is when someone has a mean heart, not when they have marks on their skin. From the mouths of babes. Ayanna thought, feeling another piece of her damaged self-image begin to heal. As the evening progressed, she found herself drawn into conversations about everything from cooking techniques to philosophy. These people didn't see her as a curiosity or an object of pity. They simply accepted her as another human being with experiences worth sharing and perspectives worth hearing. It was during the storytelling portion of the evening that Ayanna experienced her most profound moment of transformation. When called upon to share something about herself, she found herself recounting not the trauma of her burning, but the pride she had felt in saving 7 lives that night. For the first time, she told the story from the perspective of a hero. Rather than a victim, the assembled community listened with rapt attention, and when she finished, an elderly Comanche warrior named Thunderhorse stood and began a chant in the old language. Others joined in, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to lift Ayanna's spirit and carry it toward the star-filled sky above. What are they singing? She asked Winona, who was sitting beside her with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. They sing the song of the Firewalker, Winona replied. It is reserved for warriors who have proven their courage by willingly entering danger to save others. In the old days, such warriors were honored above all others. Tonight, they honor you. Ayanna felt overwhelmed by the recognition, by the understanding that her actions on that terrible night had meaning beyond the pain they had caused her. These people saw her sacrifice not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Not as the moment she became damaged, but as the moment she proved her heroism. Later that night, as she lay on the soft sleeping furs that had been prepared for her in Winona's dwelling, Ayanna reflected on the day's revelations. For 3 years, she had defined herself by what she had lost: her beauty, her voice in some ways, her place in the world. But here, surrounded by people who understood both trauma and triumph, she was beginning to remember what she had gained. She had gained the knowledge that she could face any danger if others needed her protection. She had gained the understanding that true strength came not from avoiding pain but from surviving it with grace. She had gained membership in a community of survivors who had transformed their wounds into wisdom. Most importantly, she was beginning to understand what Nawel had seen when he touched her face in that auction house. He had seen past the scars to the spirit beneath, recognizing in her the kind of courage that couldn't be purchased or sold, that existed independent of physical beauty or social acceptance. As sleep began to claim her, Ayanna allowed herself to imagine a future she had thought was impossible, a life where her scars were badges of honor rather than marks of shame, where her experiences made her valuable rather than worthless, where she could help others find the same healing she was beginning to experience outside. The sounds of the settlement settling into sleep created a symphony of safety, children's laughter fading into contented sighs, Adults sharing quiet conversations as they prepared for rest, the gentle sounds of a community that had found peace. Despite the violence that had scarred each of its members, for the first time in 3 years, Ayanna fell asleep without fear, without pain, without the crushing weight of believing herself to be irreparably broken. She slept the deep, healing sleep of someone who had finally come home to herself, surrounded by people who saw her not as she appeared to be, but as she truly was, perfect in her imperfection, beautiful in her brokenness, and valuable beyond measure because of rather than in spite of the fire she had walked through. The burned woman was learning to bloom again, tended by gardeners who understood that the most beautiful flowers often grew from the most damaged soil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, and new chances to discover just how much strength lived beneath her scars. But tonight, she rested in the knowledge that she was finally truly safe. 3 weeks had passed since Ayanna's arrival at Refugio de las Almas Perdidas, and the settlement had settled into the rhythm of early autumn. The cottonwood trees lining the hidden valley stream had begun to turn gold, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind as harvest time approached. Ayanna had found her place among the community, working alongside Maria in the settlement school, teaching the younger children traditional Kiowa songs while learning Spanish guitar from the former cantina singer. But peace in the frontier was always fragile, and the outside world had not forgotten about the disruption at Mackenzie's auction house. The first sign of trouble came with the ravens. Dakota noticed them first, blackbirds circling high above the valley entrance, their harsh cries echoing off the canyon walls in patterns that spoke of disturbance rather than natural behavior. In Comanche tradition, ravens were messengers, and their agitation meant that strangers were approaching the hidden sanctuary. Riders, Dakota reported to the council that gathered each morning in the central plaza. 3 days out, maybe 4. They're not moving like hunters or traders. They stop frequently, study the ground, circle back to check their trail. These men are tracking something. Nowell, who had been sitting quietly beside the council fire, tilted his head toward the sound of Dakota's voice. His supernatural hearing had already picked up what the young scout's eyes had confirmed: the distant vibrations of horses moving with the purposeful gait of a military formation, the barely perceptible sound of metal equipment jingling with each step. "How many?" asked Thunder Horse, the settlement's war chief, his weathered hands instinctively checking the position of his knife. 20 riders, maybe 25, Dakota replied. Too many to be a simple search party, not enough to be a full military patrol. They're carrying more gear than necessary for a short journey, which means they plan to stay in the field for an extended time. Grandmother Winona, who had been grinding corn in the traditional manner, paused in her work. "They seek someone specific," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience reading the signs of approaching danger. "The question is whether they seek one of us, or whether they seek to destroy what we have built here." Ayanna felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. She had been running from her past for 3 years, and now it seemed that past had finally caught up with her. But more terrifying than the threat to herself was the realization that her presence might have brought danger to these people who had shown her nothing but kindness and acceptance. "It's me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "They're looking for me." All eyes turned toward her, but there was no accusation in their gazes, no anger at having their sanctuary threatened by her presence. Instead, she saw only concern for her well-being and determination to protect one of their own. "Tell us," Nahul said gently, his blind eyes turning in her direction with that uncanny accuracy that still amazed her. "What enemies follow you, and why do they pursue you with such determination?" Ayanna took a shaking breath, remembering details she had tried to forget, connections she had hoped would never be made. "Before the auction house, I was owned by a man named Colonel Harrison Blackwood. He runs a research facility outside Austin. He studies pain, torture methods, ways to break prisoners without killing them. She shuddered at the memory of those sterile rooms, the clinical detachment with which Blackwood had documented her reactions to various forms of suffering. He bought me specifically because of my burns. He wanted to study how much additional pain-scarred tissue could endure, how trauma affected a person's psychological resistance to interrogation. Thunder Horse's jaw clenched so tightly that his facial muscles stood out like cords. This man tortured you for his amusement? Not amusement, Ayanna corrected, though the distinction brought little comfort. Research. He worked for the army, developing techniques they could use on captured Indians, Mexican revolutionaries, anyone they needed information from. My scars made me the perfect test subject because he could inflict pain without worrying about damaging valuable merchandise. The silence that followed her revelation was heavy with barely contained rage. These were people who had all suffered at the hands of those who saw them as less than human. But the clinical nature of Blackwood's cruelty struck them as particularly vile. I escaped during a thunderstorm 6 months ago, Ayanna continued. Lightning struck the main building, started a fire that distracted the guards. I thought I had covered my tracks, but Blackwood is persistent. He doesn't like losing his research subjects. Nahuel stood slowly, his tall frame unfolding with the fluid grace of a predator preparing for battle. This man will not take you back, he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. We do not surrender our people to monsters, regardless of what they call themselves or what uniform they wear. But Ayanna shook her head, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. You don't understand. Blackwood has connections, resources, legal authority. He can claim I'm stolen government property, that harboring me makes you all criminals. He'll destroy this place, scatter your people, turn your sanctuary into another of his laboratories. She stood abruptly, decision crystallizing in her mind with painful clarity. I have to leave. Tonight, before they get close enough to find the valley. If I'm not here, they'll have no reason to bother you. No. The word came from multiple voices simultaneously. Nahuel, Thunder Horse, Winona, and several others speaking, in unison with the firmness of absolute conviction. This is our home, said Maria, her scarred face set in lines of stubborn determination. No one drives us from our home. Not for any reason, not even to protect us. The child speaks truth, Winona added, using the term of endearment she had adopted for Ayanna, despite the age difference between them. Running from evil does not destroy it. It only ensures that it will find other victims to replace you. Sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to turn and fight. Thunder Horse began pacing around the fire, his warrior's mind already calculating strategies in defensive positions. This valley is easily defended if we are prepared. The entrance canyon can be blocked with rockfalls. The cliff faces are impossible to climb with horses. We have food stores that could last through a siege, and our knowledge of the terrain gives us significant advantages. But Blackwood isn't just any enemy, Ayanna protested. He's smart, patient, completely ruthless. He won't just charge into the canyon like some hot-headed cavalry officer. He'll find ways to force you out, use your own compassion against you. Then we must be smarter than he is, Nahuel said simply, and we have advantages he cannot anticipate. Over the next 2 days, the settlement transformed from a peaceful refuge into a fortress preparing for siege. But this was unlike any military preparation Ayanna had ever witnessed. Instead of focusing solely on weapons and fortifications, the community's defense strategy incorporated elements that reflected their unique nature as a sanctuary for society's outcasts. Joseph Crow Feather used his woodworking skills to create specialized weapons adapted for fighters with various disabilities. He carved lightweight spears balanced for one-handed use, designed crossbow mechanisms that could be operated by people with limited mobility, and created camouflaged crutches that doubled as war clubs. Sarah, despite her twisted spine, proved to be a tactical genius, using her intimate knowledge of military history to devise strategies that turned apparent weaknesses into strengths. She positioned fighters at locations where their specific limitations became advantages, placing deaf sentries where visual alertness was more important than hearing, assigning blind fighters to guard positions where their enhanced other senses gave them superior awareness. Most remarkably, the children of the settlement became integral parts of the defense plan. Their small size allowed them to move through hidden passages in the canyon walls, carrying messages and supplies to advanced positions. Their innocent appearance would make them invisible to soldiers focused on adult threats, allowing them to gather intelligence and conduct sabotage operations that larger fighters could never attempt. Blackwood expects to face broken people, Nahuel explained as he reviewed the defensive preparations. He sees scars and assumes weakness, observes disabilities, and anticipates easy victory. He cannot comprehend that suffering can create strength, that trauma can forge bonds stronger than military discipline. As the settlement prepared for battle, Ayanna found herself experiencing emotions she had thought were dead. For the first time in years, she felt protective of something precious, willing to fight rather than simply endure. These people had given her back her humanity, and she would not allow Blackwood to destroy their sanctuary, to reclaim his laboratory rat. On the third morning after the Raven's warning, Dakota returned from his scouting mission with grave news. "They're closer than expected," he reported, his young face grim with worry. "Blackwood brought more men than we anticipated, nearly 40 soldiers, plus Apache scouts who know this country as well as we do." "Apache?" Thunder Horse's voice carried surprise and concern. The Apache were traditional enemies of the Comanche, but they were also fierce warriors who commanded respect even from their adversaries. "Mescalero, from the looks of their war paint," Dakota confirmed. "Blackwood must have offered them something significant to gain their cooperation. They're following our trail with expertise that matches our own." Worse news followed. Through careful observation, Dakota had identified the composition of Blackwood's force. These weren't regular cavalry soldiers accustomed to fighting in formation against conventional enemies. They were specialists, mountain fighters, Indian scouts, men experienced in guerrilla warfare and unconventional tactics. "He's not planning a direct assault," Sarah observed after studying Dakota's intelligence report. 40 men couldn't take this valley by force, not with our defensive advantages. He's planning something more subtle, more cruel. As if summoned by their discussion, the first sign of Blackwood's true strategy appeared that afternoon. Smoke began rising from multiple points around the valley's rim, not the smoke of campfires, but the thick black smoke of burning structures. "He's destroying the line camps," Thunder Horse realized, referring to the small shelters that settlement members used during hunting and gathering expeditions outside the valley. "He's not trying to force his way in, he's trying to force us out." The diabolical genius of the strategy became clear as reports arrived from scouts positioned at the diabolical genius of the strategy became clear as reports arrived from scouts arrived from scouts positioned at the Tafe Ambusco genius of the Faye Valley's edges. Blackwood's men were systematically destroying everything the settlement depended on from the outside world. Winter food caches, seasonal shelters, even the sacred sites where the community conducted religious ceremonies. But the psychological warfare went deeper than mere destruction of property. Captured scouts brought back horrifying reports of what they had seen. Blackwood had brought portable torture equipment, setting up outdoor laboratories where he demonstrated his techniques on captured animals while positioning the displays where they could be seen from the canyon rim. "He wants you to know what he'll do to your people if you force him to take the valley by storm," Ayanna said, her voice hollow with the memory of her own experiences in Blackwood's facilities. "He's showing you what happened to me, what will happen to anyone he captures alive." The psychological pressure was immense, but it had an effect opposite to what Blackwood intended. Instead of terrorizing the settlement into surrender, his displays of cruelty only strengthened their resolve to resist. These were people who had already survived the worst that human cruelty could inflict. They would not be intimidated by threats of more suffering. "Let him show us his tools," Winona said, her weathered face set in lines of granite determination. "We will show him what happens when broken people refuse to stay broken." That night, as the settlement made final preparations for what everyone knew would be a climactic confrontation, Ayanna found herself standing with Nahuel at the edge of the central plaza. Above them, stars blazed with the fierce intensity that only existed far from civilization, while around them, the sounds of a community preparing for war created a symphony of defiance. "I'm sorry I brought this to you," she said, her voice barely audible above the night sounds. Nahuel turned toward her, his scarred face peaceful despite the approaching danger. "You brought us exactly what we needed," he replied. "The chance to prove that some things are worth fighting for, some people are worth protecting, and some evils must be confronted regardless of the cost." He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. The same touch that had first shown her she was valued despite her scars. "Tomorrow, we show the world what happens when lost souls refuse to stay lost. When broken people choose to stand together rather than fall apart." In the distance, the glow of Blackwood's campfires created an orange smudge against the star-filled sky, a reminder that morning would bring either liberation or destruction. But in the hidden valley, surrounded by people who had learned to find strength in their scars and beauty in their brokenness, Ayanna felt something she had never experienced before: the fierce joy of having something worth fighting for. The burned woman and the blind warrior, along with their community of survivors, prepared to face their demons not as victims, but as an army of the scarred who had learned that deepest wounds could become the source of the greatest strength. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the hidden valley, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an army of shadows. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, heavy with the electricity of approaching thunder and the tension of impending violence. Ayanna stood at her assigned position on the eastern cliff face, her scarred hands steady as she checked the signal mirror that would flash warnings to the fighters below. The night had passed in eerie silence after Blackwood's psychological displays ended, but everyone knew it was the quiet before devastation. Through the pre-dawn darkness, Lakota had returned with intelligence that chilled every defender's blood. Blackwood had divided his force into 3 coordinated attack groups, each designed to exploit what he perceived as the settlement's weaknesses. "He's not just trying to capture you," Lakota had reported to the hastily assembled war council. "He's conducting an experiment. He wants to test his theories about how traumatized populations respond to systematic pressure. We're not just defending our home, we're fighting to avoid becoming his laboratory rats." The first attack came not with the thunder of charging horses or the crack of rifle fire, but with something far more insidious: smoke. Blackwood's men had spent the dark hours positioning smudge pots around the valley's rim, creating a ring of choking gray smoke that began to drift down into the settlement like poison fog. "Chemical warfare," Sarah observed grimly from her command post in the central plaza. Despite her twisted spine forcing her to lean heavily on a specially designed crutch, her mind remained sharp as a blade as she analyzed the enemy's tactics. "He's trying to force us into the open where his riflemen can pick us off." But the settlement's defenders had prepared for this possibility. Joseph Crowfeather's workshop had produced not just adaptive weapons, but specialized equipment for unconventional warfare. Wet cloth masks soaked in herbal solutions protected the fighters' breathing, while mirrors positioned throughout the valley reflected the smoke back toward its sources, creating confusion in Blackwood's carefully planned attack. The real battle began when the Apache scouts attempted to scale the seemingly impossible cliff faces. These were warriors whose ancestors had been climbing desert canyons for generations, men who could find handholds where none seemed to exist. But they had not counted on the ingenuity of defenders who had learned to turn every disadvantage into strength. Maria, positioned at a camouflaged observation post halfway up the northern wall, spotted the first climbers as they emerged from the pre-dawn shadows. Her scarred throat might have stolen some of her singing voice, but it had left her with perfect pitch for the complex whistle codes the settlement used for silent communication. Her warning trilled across the canyon like a bird call, alerting defenders to the exact positions of the ascending threats. What followed was unlike any battle ever fought on the American frontier. The Apache climbers found themselves facing opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move, who had turned the cliff faces into death traps designed by people intimately familiar with the challenges of navigating difficult terrain. Thunder. Horse, despite having lost 2 fingers on his right hand to a cavalry saber years earlier, had become the settlement's master of improvised explosives. His modified grip allowed him to handle delicate fusing work that would have been impossible for someone with normal but less dexterous hands. As the Apache scouts reached predetermined positions on the cliff face, carefully placed charges brought down sections of rock that sent them tumbling back to the canyon floor. But Blackwood had anticipated resistance from the cliffs. His second wave of attack came from an unexpected direction, through the underground stream that fed the settlement's water supply. Combat engineers had spent days following the waterway to its source, mapping the subterranean passages that honeycombed the bedrock beneath the valley. The first sign of this infiltration came when little Rosa, the girl who had befriended Ayanna on her first day, came running to the command post with muddy water dripping from her dress. "The spring tastes funny," she reported with the matter-of-fact tone that children use for describing the impossible. "And there are voices coming from under the rocks." Nahol, whose supernatural hearing had already detected the subtle vibrations of movement beneath the settlement, immediately understood the implications. "They're not just trying to poison our water," he announced to the defenders. "They're planning to emerge from the underground passages directly into our strongholds." What followed was the strangest phase of the battle, a fight that took place largely in darkness, in the natural cave system that most of the settlement's members had never even known existed. Volunteers who could navigate by touch rather than sight descended into the labyrinthine passages, guided by rope lines and their intimate knowledge of how to move safely in treacherous terrain. The combat in the caves was brutal and personal, fought with knives and clubs in spaces too confined for rifles. But here, the settlement's defenders found their ultimate advantage. Blackwood soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to fight effectively in the alien environment of the underground passages. The settlement's fighters, accustomed to adapting to challenges that others found insurmountable, turned the caves into their personal battlefield. Joseph Crowfeather, his wooden legs providing unexpected stability on the uneven cave floors, led a group of defenders armed with weapons specifically designed for close-quarters combat. His modified crossbows could be loaded and fired in spaces where conventional weapons would be useless, while his intimate knowledge of balance and leverage made him devastatingly effective with the war clubs he had carved specifically for underground fighting. Meanwhile, on the surface, Blackwood himself had appeared at the valley's entrance, protected by a squad of his most experienced soldiers. Unlike the commanders who sent their men into danger while remaining safely behind the lines, Blackwood was a hands-on researcher who wanted to observe his subjects' responses to pressure in real time. He had set up a portable laboratory at the canyon mouth, complete with the same torture equipment he had used on Ayanna during her months of captivity. But this wasn't just psychological warfare, it was a genuine threat. Prisoners captured during the cliff assault were being subjected to his experimental techniques, while positioned where their screams could be heard throughout the valley. "He wants us to surrender to stop the torture," Ayanna realized, her scarred face pale with the memory of her own suffering in Blackwood's hands. "He's betting that we'll give up the valley to save the captured fighters." But Blackwood had fundamentally misunderstood the people he was fighting. These were not ordinary settlers who might be intimidated by threats to their companions. These were survivors who had already endured the worst that human cruelty could inflict, who had learned that sometimes the only way to honor suffering was to ensure it served a purpose. "We go to them," Grandmother Winona declared, her weathered hands steady as she loaded one of Joseph's specially designed rifles. "We do not abandon our people to monsters, regardless of the cost." What followed was the most audacious military maneuver in the history of frontier warfare, a coordinated assault launched not from a position of strength, but from apparent weakness. Every person in the settlement, regardless of age or physical limitation, became part of a complex battle plan that turned their supposed vulnerabilities into weapons. The children, led by Rosa and armed with slings that could deliver messages, as well as stones, scattered through the canyon approaches like a swarm of locusts. Their small size and innocent appearance allowed them to get close to enemy positions, where adult fighters would have been shot on sight. But these children had been trained by people who understood that survival sometimes required unthinkable courage from the most unlikely heroes. Sarah, her twisted spine making it impossible for her to move quickly, had positioned herself at the perfect vantage point to coordinate the assault through the complex signal system the settlement had developed. Her intimate knowledge of military tactics, combined with her understanding of each defender's capabilities and limitations, allowed her to orchestrate a battle plan that transformed apparent chaos into devastating precision. The turning point came when Ayanna herself made the decision that changed everything. Despite being the primary target of Blackwood's assault, despite knowing that capture meant a return to the clinical horrors of this laboratory, she chose to leave the relative safety of her cliff position and join the attack on his forward base. But she didn't go alone. Nahuatl, guided by Dakota and armed with weapons adapted for a blind warrior's unique combat style, led a strike force composed entirely of the settlement's most severely disabled fighters. These were people who had been written off by the outside world as useless burdens, damaged goods unfit for any meaningful purpose. The sight of them advancing across the battlefield was unlike anything Blackwood's soldiers had ever witnessed. Here came a blind Comanche warrior whose enhanced hearing allowed him to locate targets with supernatural accuracy. Beside him fought a one-armed woman whose remaining hand wielded a blade with the skill of someone who had learned to do everything with singular focus. A man with withered legs pulled himself forward on arms so powerful they could crush bones, while others whose disabilities had been transformed into advantages pressed the attack with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. Blackwood, himself, watching from his laboratory position, began to understand that his fundamental assumptions about weakness and strength had been catastrophically wrong. These people weren't fighting despite their disabilities. They were fighting because their disabilities had taught them lessons about survival, adaptation, and determination that his perfectly healthy soldiers had never learned. The battle for the laboratory became a microcosm of everything the conflict represented. Blackwood's soldiers, trained to exploit weakness and break resistance through applied cruelty, found themselves facing opponents who had already been broken by life itself and had chosen to reassemble themselves into something stronger than they had been before. When Ayanna finally faced Blackwood directly, their confrontation embodied the struggle between two fundamentally different philosophies of human worth. He saw her scars as evidence of damage, proof that she was less than whole, justification for treating her as an experimental subject rather than a person. She saw those same scars as evidence of her courage, proof that she had survived what would have destroyed others, validation of her right to be treated with dignity regardless of her appearance. "You're still my property," Blackwood snarled as his defensive perimeter collapsed around him. "Stolen government research materials. I have every right to reclaim you." "I was never your property," Ayanna replied, her voice steady despite the terror that seeing him again inspired. "I was never anything less than human, regardless of what you did to my body. And today, You learn what happens when people you've tried to break decide to fight back. The final assault was swift and decisive. Blackwood's remaining soldiers, demoralized by watching their carefully planned attack collapse into chaos, began to surrender or flee. The Apache scouts, recognizing that they had been deceived about the nature of their opponents, withdrew with the respect that warriors show to other warriors who have proven their courage. Blackwood himself, stripped of his authority and his aura of invincibility, became what he had always truly been, just another petty tyrant whose power depended on others' willingness to submit to his cruelty. Faced with people who refused to be victims, he revealed himself as fundamentally weak, a coward who had hidden his own fears behind the systematic brutalization of others. As the sun finally broke through the storm clouds that had darkened the morning, the Hidden Valley's defenders gathered to assess the cost of their victory. There had been casualties, people wounded in the fighting, some captured fighters who bore the marks of Blackwood's final desperate attempts at intimidation. But the settlement had not just survived the assault, it had proven something important about the nature of strength and the power of community. Standing among her fellow defenders, her scarred face streaked with smoke and dirt, but her eyes bright with triumph, Ayanna understood that this battle had been about more than just protecting their sanctuary. It had been about proving that people dismissed by society as damaged, worthless, or broken could not only survive but thrive when they supported each other. The burned woman, the blind warrior, and their community of lost souls had faced their demons and emerged victorious. But more importantly, they had demonstrated that healing was not about becoming unmarked, but about learning to wear your scars with pride while standing beside others who understood that true beauty came from the courage to keep fighting when the world told you that you were already defeated. The battle was over. But the real victory, the transformation of a group of discarded individuals into an unbreakable community, would last forever. 6 months after the battle that changed everything, Ayanna stood before a mirror made of polished silver, studying her reflection with eyes that no longer flinched at what they saw. The scars were still there, would always be there, the twisted landscape of melted flesh that mapped her left cheek and jaw, the pulled skin that gave her smile its distinctive asymmetry, the marks that told the story of a night when she had chosen 7 lives over her own beauty. But something fundamental had changed in how she saw those marks. Where once she had seen evidence of damage, she now saw proof of courage. Where others had seen disfigurement, she had learned to see distinction. The face looking back at her from the mirror was not the face of a victim, but the face of a survivor who had refused to let trauma define her worth. Today was special. Today, the Hidden Valley would host its first formal ceremony since the battle. Not a celebration of victory over Blackwood's forces, though that triumph still resonated through the community, but something far more significant. Today, Refugio de las Almas Perdidas would officially expand its mission, opening its doors to a wider world that desperately needed to learn the lessons of healing that had been perfected within its protective walls. The transformation had begun. Almost immediately after Blackwood's defeat, word of the battle had spread through the networks of displaced people, traveling along the invisible pathways that connected outcasts, survivors, and those whom society had deemed unworthy of full humanity. Stories told around campfires and whispered in taverns spoke of a hidden place where broken people became whole, where scars were worn like medals of honor, where the damaged and discarded had proven themselves more formidable than the forces arrayed against them. They came in ones and twos at first, then in growing numbers as winter gave way to spring. Veterans of the Indian Wars whose minds bore wounds that no army surgeon could heal, their spirits shattered by things they had done and seen in service to a cause that had never truly valued them. Women who had escaped from lives of degradation and abuse, carrying physical and emotional scars that made them unmarketable in a world that prized female submission and flawless beauty. Children, abandoned by families who couldn't afford to feed them or who were embarrassed by offspring born with disabilities that marked them as defective. Elderly people cast aside when their usefulness ended, left to die alone because their communities had decided that caring for the non-productive was an unaffordable luxury. Each arrival brought new stories of suffering, but also new possibilities for healing. The settlement's original residents, who had once been society's rejects, found themselves in the unprecedented position of being teachers, mentors, living examples of how the broken could become whole again. Ayanna had emerged as one of the community's most effective healers, not through medical training but through the simple power of shared experience. When new arrivals looked at her scarred face and saw their own damage reflected back at them, she became living proof that disfigurement was not destiny, that trauma could be transformed into triumph through community support and personal determination. "You're staring at yourself again," came a familiar voice from behind her. Nahuel entered the adobe dwelling that had become her home within the settlement, his movements as graceful and confident as ever despite his blindness. In the months since the battle, their relationship had deepened from mutual respect into something approaching romance, though neither had yet found words for the bond that connected them. "I'm practicing," Ayanna replied, turning away from the mirror to face him. "Today I speak to the territorial governor's representatives. I need to remember that my face tells a story worth hearing, not one that should be hidden." Nahuel approached her slowly, his hands finding her shoulders with the gentle certainty that had first shown her she was valued despite her scars. "Your face has never been something to hide," he said, his fingers tracing the familiar landscape of her burns with infinite tenderness. "But I understand the need to practice seeing yourself as others should see you." The formal delegation from Austin had arrived 3 days earlier, led by Governor Edmund Davis himself, along with territorial officials, military representatives, and journalists from newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco. What had begun as an investigation into reports of the Blackwood incident had evolved into something unprecedented, an official recognition of the settlement's unique approach to social rehabilitation. The story of the battle had captured the imagination of a nation struggling to heal from its own traumas. The Civil War had ended more than a decade earlier, but the wounds it left continued to fester in communities torn apart by violence, families destroyed by loss, and individuals who carried invisible scars that marked them as casualties of conflicts. They had survived in body but not in spirit. Traditional approaches to caring for society's damaged members had proven inadequate. Asylums became warehouses for the inconvenient. Veterans' hospitals turned into holding pens for men whose minds had been broken by war, and charitable institutions served more to hide society's failures than to address them. But here, in this hidden valley, a different model had emerged, one based on mutual support rather than institutional control, on healing through community rather than treatment through isolation. "Are you ready?" Nahuel asked, offering his arm, in the gesture that had become their customary way of walking together. His blindness and her scars created a partnership, where each compensated for the other's limitations while celebrating the unique strengths that those limitations had created. The central plaza had been transformed for the occasion. Instead of hiding the settlement's disabled residents, the community had made them the centerpiece of the day's presentation. Joseph Crowfeather demonstrated the adaptive tools he had developed, showing how prosthetic limbs could be crafted to not just replace lost function but to enhance human capability in unexpected ways. Maria performed songs that showcased how vocal damage could create new forms of beauty, her scarred throat producing tones that unmarked singers could never achieve. Sarah presented the educational curriculum she had developed, proving that physical limitations had no bearing on intellectual capacity or teaching ability. Children who had been abandoned or abused displayed art, performed music, and demonstrated academic skills that rivaled those of students in the territory's finest schools. Their confidence and joy stood in stark contrast to the broken spirits that had arrived at the settlement's gates, living proof that proper care and acceptance could transform even the most damaged young lives. But it was Grandmother Winona who provided the day's most powerful moment. Standing before the assembled officials with the dignity of someone who had lived through decades of change and conflict, she spoke about the traditional indigenous understanding of disability and difference. In the old ways, she said, her voice carrying the authority of accumulated wisdom, we understood that the Great Spirit creates each person with unique gifts and challenges. Those you call disabled, we called specially blessed, people given different ways of experiencing the world that allowed them to see truths hidden from others. She gestured toward Nahoil, whose blindness had become legendary for its compensation through supernatural hearing and intuitive understanding. This man sees more clearly than those with perfect vision because he has learned to perceive with his heart and spirit rather than just his eyes. Her gaze moved to Iana, whose scars caught the afternoon sunlight like badges of honor. This woman carries marks of heroism that no medal or decoration could match. Her face tells the story of someone who chose courage over safety, who valued others' lives more than her own comfort. The old woman's words reframed the entire discussion. Instead of debating how society should care for its damaged members, the conversation shifted to exploring how society could learn from those it had previously discarded. Governor Davis, a practical politician who had initially approached the settlement with skepticism, found himself genuinely moved by what he witnessed. What you've accomplished here challenges every assumption about human worth and social organization, he admitted, during the formal discussions that followed the presentations. But how do we scale this model? How do we transform an entire society's understanding of disability and difference? The answer came not from the officials or experts, but from the settlement's residents themselves. They had developed a network of communication that extended far beyond their hidden valley, connections to outcasts and survivors in towns and cities throughout the territory. What they proposed was revolutionary, a systematic effort to change how society treated its most vulnerable members by demonstrating the value that those members could provide when given proper support and recognition. We don't ask you to build more settlements like ours, Thunderhorse explained. We ask you to help us transform existing communities so that people like us don't need to hide in hidden valleys to find acceptance and purpose. The proposal that emerged from those discussions would eventually become known as the Texas Inclusion Initiative, a comprehensive program that placed disabled and disfigured individuals in positions where their unique perspectives and adapted skills could benefit entire communities. Veterans whose war trauma had left them unable to function in conventional society became counselors for others struggling with similar damage. Women scarred by abuse or accident became advocates and organizers, their personal experience giving them credibility that unmarked social workers could never achieve. Most importantly, the initiative recognized that healing was not about returning damaged people to some previous state of wholeness, but about helping them discover new forms of strength and purpose that incorporated their scars rather than hiding them. As the sun began to set on that transformative day, Ayana found herself once again standing beside Nahual, watching the official delegation prepare for their return journey to Austin. In their hands they carried documents that would change territorial policy, photographs that would appear in newspapers across the nation, and stories that would inspire similar initiatives in other states and territories. Do you think it will work? Ayana asked, her scarred hand intertwined with his calloused fingers. Can we really change how the world sees people like us? Nahuel was quiet for a moment, his blind eyes turned toward the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. I think, he said finally, that we already have. Every person who leaves this valley carrying our story becomes a seed of change. Every community that learns to value difference instead of fearing it becomes a little more whole. He turned toward her, his free hand finding her face with the gentle accuracy that still amazed her. And every time someone looks at your scars and sees heroism instead of damage, the world becomes a little more beautiful. That night, as the settlement celebrated not just their victory over Blackwood, but their emergence as a model for social transformation, Ayanna stood once more before her silver mirror. The face looking back at her was the same face she had hidden in shame for years, marked by fire and twisted by trauma. But now she saw it clearly for what it had always been, the face of someone who had chosen love over fear, courage over safety, community over isolation. The scars would always be there, mapping the night when she had run into flames to save 7 lives. But they were no longer marks of shame or symbols of damage. They were evidence of a choice made in a moment of crisis, proof that some people would sacrifice anything for others, validation of a worth that no amount of physical beauty could match. Outside her window, the sounds of celebration continued. Laughter from people who had forgotten how to laugh, songs from voices that had been silenced by trauma, conversations between individuals who had learned that sharing pain could transform it into strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that broken things could become more beautiful than items that had never been damaged. But tonight, in a hidden valley that was no longer hidden, a burned woman and a blind warrior had helped change the world's understanding of what it meant to be perfect. They had proven that beauty lived not in unmarked skin or perfect vision, but in the courage to love despite having been damaged, to hope despite having been broken, to build community among those whom society had discarded. The fire had marked Ayanna's face, but it had not destroyed her spirit. The torture had stolen Nowell's sight, but it had not dimmed his inner vision. Together, along with their community of survivors, they had transformed a refuge for the lost into a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told they were less than whole. In a world that measured worth by appearance and valued only certain kinds of strength, they had created a different way of seeing, one that recognized the sacred nature of scars, the beauty of brokenness, and the perfect imperfection of people who had learned to bloom again after being burned by life's cruelest flames.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.